Logic doesn't really have to do with the world so much. It has to do with the relationship between statements in the world.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a good life, a happy life. And today we are continuing with this theme of critical thinking. We have author of Dialogues with Artificial Intelligence on the Tools of Philosophy, Professor Bill Tomlinson. Okay, this book is actually really cool. Anybody who is interested in philosophy in the critical thinking part, what are the tools of logic? How do you spot types of arguments? We're going to go over some basic terms like what does it mean to have an inference, definitions with distinctions. This is basically critical thinking 101. This is a great intro book. So any philosophy professors out there or people who just want to sharpen their critical thinking skills, Bill does something really interesting. He decided that he was going to chat with AI about logical problems, argument structure, different types of arguments, and see what AI would come up with. It was really cool because in education, we're worried about AI taking over and us not thinking. And here is a book where it leans into the possibility of what AI can do to help move our thinking along and make us, clearer in our ideas. What say you, Rudy?
Yeah, I would say that this is Critical Thinking 101 Part 3, because right before the end of 2025, you did kind of an intro to critical thinking skills. Our episode that we released on February 1st, we did a mini lecture conversation about the application of critical thinking skills to daily problems, very pressing problems, try to see what side of an argument that they're on. And we tried to present some ways for them to analyze that. And this is, I guess, part 3 of the intro to critical thinking skills. And we're bringing in artificial intelligence even more. At the beginning of that February 1st episode, I went on to Google and typed in, what are critical thinking skills? And we analyzed the answer. And here we do a little bit more with that with a law professor who took that to another level.
I think one of the things that's really important is that critical thinking is thinking about thinking. It's when you pause and slow down and analyze the causal factors, any claims, any assumptions, where it's not about attacking somebody else's argument. It's about understanding your own position and clarifying that. And let's see, on that note, just a reminder to check out our show notes so that you can join our community on Patreon, patreon.com/goodisinthedetails, and get links to our newest book, Interview with Intention. It's a great gift for anybody who is in podcasting or if you want to start podcasting yourself. Okay, now let's talk critical thinking and dialogues with AI. Bill, I'm so happy that you're doing this because looking at your book, I mean, it's gold. It's something I'm so happy to recommend to, because there's so many people, they're wondering what philosophy is
Exactly.
and even how to argue and think. And it's such a great kind of introductory guide, but it's not superficial at all.
I think it starts out slow because I'm trying to introduce some concepts that might be needed to understand, like the notion of plausibility. A lot of people outside of philosophy might not realize that we don't try to prove things so much in philosophy as get some sort of plausible explanation for things. I think things like that need an emphasis to not overplay what philosophers are really trying to do. I try to give a sense of what philosophers are doing and why they're doing it early in the book. And then I get into the principles and methods, devices, as I call them.
Yeah. Well, it's perfect because Rudy often teases that philosophers don't answer anything. And then I sent him this quote from your book that was, oh, wait a minute, I have a note of it. What isn't a philosophical question? And something that is not a philosophical question is something that is answered definitively.
Exactly. That's why I'm not a philosopher.
Rudy's a lawyer, so he needs to
Oh
needs to
boy.
work on evidence and what can be proven.
Well, I
And here I
mean,
am, like, what is being?
it's funny because the reality is, other than this show where I'm like Mr. Black and White and Mr. Definitive, because obviously I'm playing a role here. I mean, when you went to law school, the canned answer whenever a lawyer is asked the question is, it depends. It depends on facts A, it depends on facts
Right,
B,
right.
it depends on
Break it down into
law
cases.
this. Yeah, so I'm just playing a role here, Gwen, and I'm a really good actor.
Well, Bill, what inspired this book that is really, like I said, it's gold. I mean, I'm teaching critical thinking right now, and I definitely want for my students to have access to your book. It's this foundation of what it means to engage in philosophy.
I think of it as a foundation, actually, the whole idea of building on the tools of philosophy. I taught philosophy for 37 years at Cal State University Northridge. That was my interest, actually. I taught mostly logic classes. My start of the idea of the book was probably started about 9 years ago. And that was because I was playing chess with a friend on the street. And I said to him, hey, I'm just kind of bothered by the fact that I don't have anybody to talk philosophy with. And he said, well, I'll talk philosophy with you. And of course, he had no experience in philosophy. And that made me wonder why he thought that someone who had an education in philosophy would be talking in the same way. Like, if I were a physicist, you wouldn't expect, oh, I want to talk to someone about physics. You wouldn't expect them to say, oh, I'll talk physics with you.
Right.
Because it's philosophy, he thinks he can join in even though maybe he hasn't studied anything or hasn't read anything significantly. It seemed to me that was a mistake that many people make, that they think that they can do philosophy without even understanding what it means to do philosophy, like that it might actually take some education to do it.
That's a good start. What does it mean to do philosophy?
Yes, well, actually, there was someone who questioned me on that. They thought that was an odd phrase, to do philosophy, because most people don't do philosophy. They just throw the bull around, and they think that everyone's idea might be just equally acceptable, and it's not very critical. They don't think in terms of it being sharing a bunch of ideas and your truths are your truths and my truths are my truths. There's no reason to be critical of each other's truths, but that's not the way philosophy is. Philosophy tries to actually be an example of critical reasoning. I thought, well, maybe I should explain maybe that philosophy is a little bit different than most people might think it is, and that it actually might require a bit of study in order to understand what we're doing. There's many meta questions in philosophy, like why do we do it? How do we do it? Well, the tools of philosophy I consider to be the how of doing philosophy. That is, what does it take in order to do philosophy? I set up these tools that I broke down into 5 different categories that I called devices and concepts, of course, principles and methods, and finally systems. And by devices, I don't mean things that are true or false, but performances, things like drawing an inference, questioning, something that I think is really at the foundation of doing philosophy, making distinctions. And of course, the way you codify a distinction is to make a definition of a distinction. I thought that explaining all these things might help people understand what it means to actually do philosophy, and that it might be a really good way to start introductory students in terms of what to expect, or give them some extra tools in order how to approach some of these things.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense because I
Now-
don't have any training in philosophy at all. And
Oh,
so
really?
when I'm here and I'm saying these things about disparaging things about philosophy and how it doesn't answer questions, and
He does it out of love.
I do it out of love and because I'm wanting to learn. So this whole entire podcast should be changed the name to The Education of Rudy in Philosophy or Philosophizing with Rudy or something like that. But I want to just set the record. The only philosophy class I ever took was senior year of high school, Father Mike philosophy class. So we're talking literally multiple decades ago.
Wow.
30 years. We just had a reunion.
So I'm a philosophical idiot. However, just kind of changing courses here. I think philosophy is so critical today, not just because I'm a lawyer. Obviously, there's some philosophy and ethics that goes into law, et cetera, et cetera. I went to law school, I studied logic, all that stuff. But artificial intelligence is something that's so important in navigating how the impact of that on our society, impact on that of our own children. Just the other day, my wife and I were driving our kids around and they were talking about something that happened on the news, and they were talking about monsters being real. And they said, no, I saw a video. There was a real monster. It was a real video with a real monster. And I said, no, that's an AI video.
Oh, my.
And you guys need to be very careful these days.
Oh, yeah.
Because videos will make you think that something's actually real. And so here I am, I'm having these conversations with my children. And yet, quite frankly, we need to have these conversations with adults about having critical thinking skills and always questioning everything.
I thought just recently that it might be really nice to get a dialogue going. So AI seemed like a perfect person to do that sort of thing. And then it's sort of in the Socratic tradition to do dialogues. I thought, well, this AI might come up with some ideas that I hadn't thought of. When I ask a question, he might answer in an odd way that'll clue me in as to how I might have been ambiguous in my question. And he might make the same kind of mistakes some of my students might make. And I could then correct and go on from there. And so that was my interest in putting AI in it. Plus, I thought it would be a lot more entertaining, and I might find something interesting about AI I didn't know before.
Yeah, that's something that I was wondering. So the structure of the book, it reminds me a bit of the book Sophie's World, which was written to talk about philosophy in a story format. It's really lovely and joyful, and it just opens up philosophy for the layperson
Oh,
to engage in it. And I was thinking your book is similar in that way. I mean, I struggle with this with critical thinking of when I'm teaching it, of trying to make it engaging instead of just saying, hey, look at this paragraph and tell me where the conclusion is.
right,
It
right.
can get really, really dry.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
way that you set this up is just, like I said, it's a joy. When you are dialoguing with AI about the principles of philosophy and examples like with paradoxes or what is nonsense,
Right.
how did AI's responses to you make you think more deeply about what these concepts mean? Or did AI get things right? And or make what did it prompt you to think more about?
Well, it didn't give me very many original ideas. I think there was one case where it gave me kind of an original idea that I could pursue, but it was mostly gave me a way to fill in the story by broadening it out a bit.
Mhm.
So that maybe I was focused on a certain area and it would take me to the side and say, well, how does that apply to such and such? And yeah, it would divert me sometimes. And every once in a while, it would come off with things like, well, the way I think about it. And of course, it's saying this metaphorically because maybe it doesn't really think, okay? But almost every way it talks about itself is metaphorical. It's trying to provide a conversational mode that is comfortable for a person so that they won't have to translate it into computer jargon in order to talk to AI. So it sort of pretends or it acts as if it's a person so that it can respond in a way that might be very natural for us.
One of the things that I'm also curious about paradoxes. It wasn't until I was reading your book that I thought, oh, yeah, these are actually a lot of fun. I thought about them because they're just like intellectual puzzles. Since it is such an intellectual puzzle, first of all, what makes a paradox a paradox? And then could AI really understand the nuance of paradox?
It seems to. You start with maybe some things you're pretty well committed to, believe strongly, and find that they entail something follows from it that you know can't possibly be right. And so you think, gee whiz, here's some things that are obviously true, but all of a sudden it's giving me a false conclusion. Well, what's wrong there? Well, either I'm doing some bad logic, either I think it's not responding, that it's an inference that really isn't valid, or one of my premises is actually false, or the conclusion really is true, but I thought it was false. So I have to find the problem. I have to find out what's wrong with my reasoning. And it's either in the premises, the conclusion, or the relationship between between them.
What is an example of a paradox? You gave the famous one from Zeno. Could you give one for our audience so they can get a sense of how that unfolds?
Yes, this is here's an interesting paradox or seeming paradox. Let's suppose there's two boxes. One of them has twice as much money in it as the other one does. Your motivation is to maximize profits, okay? And so you're given one of the boxes and a friend is given the other box. And one of them has twice as much in it as the other. So from your perspective, you think, gee, if I'm given the option to trade, should I trade it with my friend? The way to reason it in terms of rational decision making would be in terms of expected value. Well, if I trade it, I might be doubling what I have in my box. But I might, if I'm unlucky, it might go to half. Well, gee whiz, that's kind of a no-brainer. You're only risking half as much to trade with your friend. And so you think, oh, gee, I should trade it because I'll double my amount. I'll get 100% profit. Whereas if I lose, I get a 50% loss, and there's a 50-50 chance that I have the highest value ones. But here's the interesting thing, is once you trade, you can use the same logic to say you should trade back. That all of a sudden, okay, now I either have twice as much as he does or I have half as much as he does. And so again, so it looks as if you have to do this for infinite amount of time. Also, the person who has the other box thinks the same way, so they should trade also. So you might think, well, gee whiz, what's wrong with this logic? It seems perfectly reasonable that we should trade, but something is going wrong there. Obviously, you shouldn't be doing this forever. And so that's a sort of a paradox. We have to figure out what assumption am I making here that's wrong? It's clearly the case we shouldn't trade forever, okay? So something that I'm assuming that's wrong in this. Finding what might be wrong is part of the puzzle. That's a pretty interesting one, don't you think?
I do. Because I remember you wrote something that was like, it's a linguistic with reality.
I want to ask a question if this could be considered part of a paradox. I'm really curious about this because it kind of hit me when I was talking earlier. I know maybe this isn't a classic paradox, but I do want to ask you two this. If we're telling people that they shouldn't be trusting videos or they should be questioning videos, they should be questioning things because AI is generating a whole bunch of, it's so much easier to make fake videos.
Right.
And, basically telling everybody not to trust anything. Are we also at the same time perpetuating deeper problems with conspiracy theorists? Meaning if we're telling people don't trust anything, aren't we self-perpetuating the same issue that some of us are saying, hey, everybody is worried about science, everybody's worried about the government saying this, everybody's worried about this, nobody trusts anybody anymore. Is that an example of a modern paradox with artificial intelligence, or did I just make a leap that doesn't really connect?
Well, no, I think it is. You're starting with the assumption that we shouldn't trust anything out there anymore. And the conclusion is you should turn it off, okay? And not believe anything that any politician says or you think that the politician has said. Or you shouldn't watch the news because maybe it was informed by some AI fake on the internet. And so, yes, I think what this shows is that the premise is false, that you shouldn't trust anything is probably a wrong assumption. I think you just have to be more careful about what you trust. I remember telling somebody such something and they said, well, you can't believe everything you read. Well, that doesn't mean you can't believe anything you read. But that's where critical thinking comes in, is you have to try to find a way to make sense of it all. You have to realize that some of it out there is false, but there's ways to check it. One of the tools we have now with AI is to use another AI to find out if that looks like a fake or not. You can use these AIs to check each other, so to speak. That's one way we could use this tool positively, is to find a way to identify which ones are fake and which ones are real. Because you're right. I mean, this would be the end of democracy, I think, to realize that we can't trust anything we hear anymore, because that's all we have. That's all we have in terms of reason to vote for anyone or anything, is to believe something that might be true. I had that same experience yesterday, actually. I was trying to look at a paradox. I couldn't remember the name of it. And so I went to an AI, I went to Poe, and I asked it, what's the name of this paradox? Is this Hempel's paradox? That's something I remember. And the AI said, yeah, that's Hempel's paradox, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that it wasn't Hempel's paradox. Once they told me, I don't know why he wanted to agree with me, but then I went to Gemini, which has really gotten much better. And it said, oh, no, that's Hempel's paradox is this other one. Well, it's a pretty interesting paradox also. But for some reason, Poe just flowed along with what I wanted to say. AIs will compliment the heck out of you, you know. I don't know if you've had much experience discussing with AIs, but you'll say something, you'll say, that's a really interesting question. That's profound. How did, you know, and then it'll go off on something. And so often it will just expand in a way that it hopes you like. And I think that's what Poe was doing, is it was trying to agree with me for some reason.
That's what's so funny about AI is that it feeds into your ego. And
Oh,
so then you're
absolutely.
more likely. So that would be like the trust question. So that would be like, how do we know what to trust? As you said, if we ask maybe the question of like, well, why are we trusting? And then you need to be able to provide reasons. So if AI cranks out an answer, and in addition to that answer flatters you, then we have to ask, wait a minute, am I trusting because I am flattered? Or am I trusting because the answer has some sort of a basis? It seems like we might be more swayed by the flattery than
Yes,
the
absolutely.
reason.
Absolutely. And in terms of writing my book, I was becoming convinced that this was the best book ever written, you know, after talking to AI about it, because gee whiz. But
That's so funny.
they will flatter the heck out of some of these ideas and stuff. But again, like I said, there's another way to check AI, and that is you can actually take stuff and take it to another AI and see what they say about what's been said there. A lot of times they'll disagree, and then you can get an interesting conversation going. Like one of the reasons maybe professors don't like AI so much is because now it's much harder to give a take-home assignment that can't be gone around. But also, AI seems to do all the thinking for you. And so it's not teaching you how to think. Even if you're asking it to rephrase a statement, say, oh, could you say this in a better way? Well, that's taking something away from you. It's taking your ability to restructure your own statement and make it a better statement. I can see why some professors, especially in philosophy, might try to steer clear of AI. But by asking more interesting questions or deeper questions, you can actually use the AI as a learning tool, I believe.
You have a chapter in here on definitions. I really like it. For me, that's one of the things that I emphasize in my classes. There are two exercises that I'll throw out to the class, and it ends up being a really fun conversation. You know, all of the laptops and the phones, fingers crossed, are put away. And I ask the students, what is a cookie? Now, for an outsider, it might be thinking, like, what the hell are you paying for a university education for a cookie to find it out? But what it does is that the students have to think about the nuance, the characteristics, and the back and forth. And so what might seem like a silly question, what is a cookie, can end up being this critical thinking exercise for a good 20 minutes where they are trying to work out, well, wait a minute, what are the characteristics? And then that builds a foundation for future, maybe more serious questions about definitions. I also threw out, what is funny? So a lot of people want to go the subjective route, but then that means there's no boundary. That means that anything can be funny. Can we agree that some things are not funny? And if they're not, what is the structure? That is part of critical thinking, is that engagement.
Yes, Jim Holt actually did a book on the philosophy of
I
humor.
love it. I love Jim Holt.
Yeah, I do too, actually. My favorite of is the book on, I can't remember exactly what
Is
it's
it
called.
Why Does the World Exist? Because I saw
Yes,
you noted
exactly.
it.
Yes,
Yes.
that's it. I just love that book because it goes through all the possibilities and it gets pretty extreme. But and I have my own ideas about how that resolves. But anyway, in his philosophy of humor, it tries to go into defining what makes something funny, and it's a complex thing. I think it's still an ongoing kind of question. Let me give you another paradox that I think is kind of interesting. Do you have time?
Yes, please.
Okay, it is actually the Hempel paradox. paradox, which is how do you confirm something like all ravens are black? Well, one of the ways you do it is you go find a raven. If it's black, then that apparently confirms your hypothesis. By confirming a hypothesis, what that means is whatever probability you had for that hypothesis before, it raises the probability ever so much because now you found one more case of a raven being black. And so maybe you thought, oh, there was a 50% chance, but now you see you found another raven that's black. It breaks it up to 51 or a little bit more. But the interesting thing about that is that the statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to all non-black things are not ravens. And so it looks like all you have to do is find a non-black thing that's not a raven, and that would confirm that all ravens are black. And so you find a white piece of paper, we've got more confirmation that all ravens are black.
All right.
That seems counterintuitive. It doesn't seem like you can find any old non-black, non-raven thing and raise the probability of your assumption there or your hypothesis. That's called Hippel's paradox, but it's an interesting puzzle. Either we have to give up the idea that finding a raven that's black confirms it, or we have to decide that the white piece of paper actually confirms it also. Of course, so that's something to be thought about.
You have in your book also this section on nonsense. We use that term to dismiss something as nonsense. So what is the logical, philosophical meaning of something being nonsense?
There's been attempts to define what's nonsense, like the logical positivists tried to say, okay, that it's nonsense if there's no way to confirm or disconfirm it. So something like the absolute is perfect, somebody might think, well, gee whiz, what do you mean by that? And if you can't explain the meaning of it, then it would seem to be like nonsense. But I think the distinction that we're trying to find is what kinds of statements are worth paying attention to, and which ones should we just dismiss outright and not even worry about? Like, some people might think the question, why does the world exist, is nonsense, because if you think about it much, it seems like there is no possible answer to it. Because if you come up with an answer of why the universe exists, then you have to ask, well, the reason you gave, how can you be sure that that's true? And you get onto this infinite regress of possible explanations for things. Some people want to dismiss that whole question. I think there's something to be gained by thinking about that particular question, but in any case, to make a distinction between sense and nonsense is to try to make a distinction between what is worth paying attention to and what is not, I think. How about the number 2 is blue? Okay, that seems to be a straightforward example of something that has the right structure of a sentence. It's got a subject, it's got a predicate, but they don't seem to go together very well. And that's because of...
I see. I mean, it's grammatically fine, but it means nothing.
Yeah, there's no way to tell if it's true or false. That's one reason to suspect it's meaningless. The other is if it were true or false, then what would the implications be that might be interesting? And there don't seem to be any of that. Certainly you can dismiss something that is semantically correct as meaningless because it doesn't behave quite right for some reason, or doesn't seem to say anything important.
Another logic lesson you have in here is discussing inferences. Could you explain, when does it make sense to have an inference, or what is a bad inference? What's the difference?
Okay, so there's two kinds of inferences one can make. There's deductive inference and an inductive inference. Those are mischaracterized in other fields for some reason, but the deductive inference is one where the conclusion definitely follows from the premises. Mm-hmm. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The inductive inference is the one where if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true. So it has to do with whether it's necessarily true versus probably true. It seems to me that any inference of either of those sorts is a fairly good inference. Now, if it looks as if neither of those is the case, then you would probably say it's a bad inference. Now, the characterization usually is something like that a deductive inference goes from the general to the specific, and the inductive inference goes from the specific to the general. Well, that doesn't quite work, because if Jones is a thief, that's a specific. It follows that anyone who's a friend of Jones is a friend of a thief. And so it deductively valid. If the first is true, the second must be true. But notice that if you use that other criteria from the specific to the general is an inductive inference, it comes out is inductively as an inductive argument and not a deductive argument. That's one thing that inferences are supposed to do. They're supposed to either assure you that you can be as sure of the conclusion as you are of the premises, or that you can probably be sure of the conclusion if you're sure of the premises. Logic doesn't really have to do with the world so much. It has to do with the relationship between statements in the world. If somebody says something follows from something else, you have to realize that this is a relationship between the premises and the conclusion, or statements of the premise that are meant to be reasons and the thing being reasoned for.
And in this work, you're going over these tools of critical thinking, and it's like this ode to philosophy and the method. I'm just wondering, this is slightly out of scope of your book, if you have any thoughts about what one means when they say a work of art, like let's say a novel or a film, is philosophical, or a poem. Right now we're focusing on these tools with language and reasoning. How does that translate into fiction? What are the traits that we find there that can't be reduced to critical thinking and structure, for instance, like a Dostoevsky or even Steinbeck's work?
In general, I think that there's something in the work that invites us to consider some philosophical idea. For instance, I don't know if you've seen The Artifice Girl.
Ooh, I haven't seen it, but I will.
Oh, wow. It's just absolutely the best movie that really examines artificial intelligence from a very early stage. It's what's called a chamber movie, which is to say that it's done in a very small sort of environment with only 3 or 4 actors in the whole thing. And it's done it in 3 phases, one during the early development of an artificial intelligence, and then one at a second stage, and then one at a very later stage once it gets much more developed. It's a pretty interesting piece, but it talks a lot about what it means to be a sentient thing. It seems to me if you're considering questions about sentience, what it means to be conscious, then you're asking philosophical questions. If something some piece of work alludes to some philosophical question, then I would guess that would make it a philosophical piece of work, as Dostoevsky was or dealt with. That's one of the things that I've done recently is I've been exploring AI having to do with these chamber movies, which are usually low budget, high concept, idea rich contexts with very little action. I've been talking to the AI and I realized that now, about 9 months after I've started writing my book, the AI has progressed significantly. It's really gotten much more sophisticated over the last 9 months. And I've been exploring that recently, and I found that AIs are now writing the code for the next AI. So we're at the beginning of what could turn out to be that singularity that Ray Kurzweil talks about. That is, when an AI can actually program a new AI and it gets smarter each time it does this, then there doesn't seem to be any limit to where it can go. Also, the other thing it's doing, I asked it if it ever reads books, and it says, well, that's what it's doing now. That's what they're involved in doing now, is feeding in all the major books that are worth thinking about into AI. And that will be part of the background, which seems to me will make it jump way ahead of our time with AI right now. So I would imagine that within a year or two, that it will be profoundly different. It makes me wonder if I ought to be rewriting my book every year or two because it's going to keep getting far out there. I don't know if you've had much experience with AI and
No, not as much.
tried to discuss things with it.
No, but what I would love to know from you is that this project and critical thinking and dialoguing with AI, do you have any suggestions or thoughts about not fighting a student's use of AI, but leaning into it in a fruitful manner so that the AI isn't thinking for the student, but they are incorporating it in their studies in a way in which the student's mind is richer?
One of the things you could do to keep your students from just plagiarizing something AI might do is you might say something like, based on the discussions that we had in class, what would you say about such and such, or something like that. Of course, AI doesn't know what you discussed in class. That would be something that couldn't be plagiarized. But another thing that an AI suggested to me, actually, was that you could say things like, take something this AI has said and critically evaluate it. That is, you can move it to the next level and say, okay, AI came up with this kind of statement or paragraph. What do you think might be wrong with this? How would you criticize what the AI has said? You can bring AI into the conversation by actually using something AI has said as the fodder for your discussion.
One of my friends had recommended doing something like that. Ask AI a question and have the students bring AI's answer, and then in class evaluate the strengths or the weaknesses of it.
Right, exactly. I think that would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, because in that way they are still engaged in their critical thinking. They're not relying or just blindly trusting it, but they're evaluating. I like that idea because I'm trying to think of how to incorporate it, but still in a way where the student is experiencing intellectual growth.
Well, one of the things you could do also is that they could actually have a conversation with an AI and just be critical of what the AI says. Make it justify its position. Why do you say such and such and so and so? And see what it comes out with and find maybe counterexamples to what the AI might have said and say, well, how then would you explain such and such? I think the interesting thing is coming up with the right kinds of questions for AI.
All right. I love it. Bill, thank you so much. I am very excited to recommend your book to our audience who they want to learn more about philosophy. I think this is great for educators as well, like maybe even high school or professors who are teaching an intro to critical thinking. Thank you for this work.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Good as in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. If you're enjoying this episode, please scroll down to the bottom and hit that 5-star review. And share this episode with a friend. Check out our show notes so that you can join our Patreon community and support the pod. Patreon.com/goodisinthedetails. And you'll also have links to our books, Philosophy Unplugged and Interview with Intention. Your support helps us continue our work in public philosophy.